Max Domi is currently playing in the bottom 6 of a Toronto Maple Leafs team that is loaded with superstars. However, Max Domi at one time a little over 5 years ago was able to help bring an entire franchise to a point of playoff contention once again. This franchise would be the Montreal Canadiens, and it would all stem from one trade. This is the trade that gave the Montreal Canadiens a star that would turn into a superstar in Max Domi. Max Domi was an extremely promising forward that was drafted in the first round as the 12th pick in the 2013 NHL draft for the Phoenix Coyotes. He's described as a wonderful playmaker with fantastic puck handling. Domi is also seen as a player with quick acceleration and elite top-end speed. He would demonstrate these talents with the London Knights in the OHL, and this is how he got himself to be drafted in the first round. After he was drafted, he would go on to have more wonderful seasons with the London Knights, getting more and more points in less games every single season. In Domi's draft year, he had picked up 87 points in 64 games, and a couple of seasons after his draft year, he was able to get 102 points in 57 games while being the captain of the London Knights. This wonderful play would earn Domi a spot in the big leagues, and with the Arizona Coyotes, he would prove himself big time, as in his first 10 NHL games, he would score a point in 7 of these 10 games, and would have 10 points in his first 10 games. He would go on to have an insane rookie season, with Domi getting 52 points in 81 NHL games, while having 18 goals and 34 assists in the process, and would end up losing the Calder Trophy to now NHL superstar Artemi Panarin. In Domi's next 2 seasons, he would have good seasons, but unfortunately, he would not be as good as he was in his rookie season, and was never able to get back to that 52-point caliber, and this is where the Montreal Canadiens come into play. The Montreal Canadiens in the 2017-2018 season were disappointing to say the least, as in the season prior, the Montreal Canadiens were almost a 50-win team, with them having 47 wins, but there was a glaring issue: the offense. In the years prior to the 2018-2019 season, the Canadiens' offense was never really great. They were always in the middle of the pack, being either top 15 or even sometimes being in the top 20. What made up for this, though, was an extremely good defense. A defense that was usually always in the top 10, and one of the best goalies in the entire world in Carey Price on top of that. However, this fluctuated over the years, and the Montreal Canadiens went from having a top 5 defense to the next year having a top 20 defense, and with not having a so great offense, the Canadiens fell. Because of this, the Canadiens needed to make a splash in the offseason, and so the Montreal Canadiens made a decision to trade Alex Galchenyuk over to the Arizona Coyotes, and the Montreal Canadiens would acquire Max Domi. In the first 10 games of the 2018-2019 season, the Canadiens had started with a good record of 6-2-2, with Max Domi and Brandon Gallagher pretty much leading the charge for the Canadiens, as at this point they had both combined for 11 goals. But in the next 15 games, it wouldn't go so well, and the Canadiens would lose 5 in a row and would fall out of a playoff spot with a record of 11-9-5, as they would lose to the Carolina Hurricanes. However, something seemed to click for this Montreal Canadiens core, as after that point, the Canadiens had won 6 out of the next 8 games to propel them back into a playoff spot. With that in mind, the Canadiens would continue to fight to stay in a playoff spot, and by February of 2019, the Canadiens were able to secure the 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division away from the Boston Bruins, and were able to hold an offense that was in the top 10 in the Eastern Conference, thanks to not only Domi leading the charge, but you also have Jonathan Drouin, Brandon Gallagher, Philip Deneau, Andrew Shaw, hell, even Tomas Tatar. But honestly, I feel like he deserves a whole video of his own. It was the depth that the Montreal Canadiens had desperately needed, and now they were managing to win. However, something had went wrong. The Canadiens had went on a 4-game losing streak, and when you're in a tight race for the playoffs, you cannot do this. And unfortunately for the Canadiens, this 4-game losing streak would cost them big time, as not only did they lose their 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division, they're also fighting to keep the final wildcard spot, as the Carolina Hurricanes, who we know have already crossed paths with the Canadiens this season, were hot, and as were hot on their trail. As with the 3-game winning streak, the Hurricanes were only a single point behind the Canadiens. The Montreal Canadiens needed to desperately do something, and with a win over Philly and a 2-game winning streak, the Canadiens were able to hold on and grab a hold of the first wildcard spot. However, the Hurricanes were still 3 points behind them. At this point in the season, you're really unable to breathe when you're fighting for a playoff spot, and as the days went on, the season approached the middle of March, and the Blue Jackets, the Penguins, and the Hurricanes were all fighting for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th spot in the Metro Division, and the Canadiens were caught right in the middle of it, as with 2 losses versus San Jose and Anaheim, the Canadiens Canadiens had fallen out of a playoff spot for the first time since November, and things were getting grim for Montreal, and desperation was beginning to set in. Max Domi, along with the other depth pieces, had transformed the Montreal Canadiens offense into something to legitimately be afraid of, but wasn't going to be enough to propel the Canadiens into the playoffs. The Canadiens after this point were able to beat Detroit 3-1 to gain some ground in the playoff race to make it closer, but then the Canadiens would fall even deeper when they would lose consecutive games to the Islanders and then the Blackhawks. The Canadiens now at this point were 3 points out of a playoff spot and even in games with Columbus. Things were looking bad for Montreal, but then something awakened within this core. It felt like they really wanted this badly, as after this point the Canadiens managed to go on a 3-game winning streak and in the process shutting out the Metro Division leader in the New York Islanders, and all of a sudden the Canadiens aren't out of it yet, as they are back in a playoff spot, as Columbus at this point was 3 points behind Montreal with 1 game in hand. The Canadiens were so close, all they had to do was just keep this pace. The Canadiens would have to face off against Carolina once again, and we know how it went the last time. And unfortunately, as the Hurricanes have been a thorn in the Canadiens side this entire season, the Canadiens barely pulled out a win in overtime. The Canadiens managed to get a point out of this, but they lost the 3-point lead on the Blue Jackets, and now the Blue Jackets are only 2 points behind the Canadiens with a game in hand. Montreal will continue to beat Florida to continue to keep the lead on the Blue Jackets, but the loss to the Hurricanes in overtime set up not the biggest game of the season for Montreal, and on March 28th of 2019, it would be the Canadiens versus the Blue Jackets to determine who would take that final wildcard spot. The Canadiens had started this game with a 1-0 lead, however the Blue Jackets would dominate the rest of the game, and unfortunately the Canadiens would fall out of a playoff spot once again to the Columbus Blue Jackets with a loss of 6-2. But the Canadiens weren't done yet. The Canadiens had won 2 in a row after this point, and not only beat the President's Trophy winners in the Tampa Bay Lightning 4-2 just to keep this playoff dream alive. And as the Blue Jackets had finally lost a game, the Canadiens with a 2-game winning streak were right back in it, and all they had to do was beat the Washington Capitals and they would be in. But Nick Dowd wasn't going to let that happen, and just like that, the Blue Jackets had a game in hand while being in the final wildcard spot, and the Canadiens sitting on the outside looking in with a 2-1 loss to the Washington Capitals. The Blue Jackets needed to lose the next game in order for the Canadiens to stay alive, but with Artemi Panarin netting the game winner in the shootout against the Rangers, the Columbus Blue Jackets successfully had eliminated the Montreal Canadiens from playoff contention for the second straight year. If only the Canadiens at 1 game hadn't lost to the Blue Jackets. But hey, this was how a star in Max Domi had managed to turn into a superstar, and along with the others on the Montreal Canadiens, were able to carry the Canadiens all the way back into playoff contention again. However, they were just 2 points short from greatness.